Hey, so we are well familiar, I would argue, with analyzing book-to-screen translations of work. But at least for me personally, I am not as versed in the opposite. I don't remember the last time I read a novelization of something that started as either a TV show or a movie. I believe the biggest one that I could think of off the top of my head, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Crimson Peak, but I did not read that or watch the movie all the way through because I am, as previously discussed, a scaredy pants, even though that seems like it should live right in my wheelhouse. But other than that, the last thing I can really think of goes back to like childhood and novelizations of movies that you would like pick up at the Scholastic Book Fair or in the library. I know I read the Buffy novelization of the video game Chaos Bleeds, though I never played the video game. And as expected, because it was based on a video game, the internal logic of that novel made absolutely no sense, and it had a lot of Sid the Dummy. So I guess if that is something you are missing from your Buffy content, there you go. So obviously Queen Charlotte the series has been out, and the book, which is a tandem project between Julia Quinn and Shonda Rhimes, came out after the release of the series, and it is a spin-off of the Bridgerton world. And as you know, if you have read the Bridgerton books since the series dropped or before, the Queen Charlotte, is not a part of the world of Bridgerton in the books as they stand. So we're gonna take a look at it and see if we think the book was better than the show in this instance. Now, schedule permitting, I am hoping to still get a Future Friday up for this week. However, I am in the midst of being new to a new job, which means my schedule is new and is involving going into the office again, which is great, but does cut down a little bit on filming time. Additionally, I have a lot of plans after work this week, as well as a certain concert on Friday. So I do not know whether my schedule will allow me to get a dedicated Feature Friday up this week. I'm still crossing my fingers. However, this is a 2023 release, so I'm telling myself it still counts as digging into a new title for the year in terms of breaking the streak that means absolutely nothing. So let's jump into this, and I do want to start off with just the question of Julia Quinn telling this story, period. I know Bridgerton is her intellectual property, but having read this book, really the only thing tying it to the book world of the Bridgertons is the Smythe Smiths. So I think it really would have been a great opportunity to bring on another author into this world, especially a Black romance author, whether established or up and coming. And this does segue us into some of the controversial comments that Julia Quinn apparently made, I believe in 2017 on a panel about diversity in her work. And I want to be really careful with this, and I recognize that this is a very nuanced conversation. However, I am very aware of my privilege as a white woman in this, but I do want to discuss it because it may be a deal breaker for some, and there is a chance that you haven't heard of it because I hadn't heard of it. I had seen it kind of referenced without names attached in tweets. I thought a lot of the kind of pushback and dialogue we were having around Bridgerton at the time was the fact that it was a more diverse representation of the source material, and that there are authors of color who could be translated to the screen to tell those stories. And so I wasn't aware of the full nuance of this conversation, and the comment in question here was also referenced, I believe, in Black Love Matters, which is a nonfiction title which I have read and talked about on this channel and is surprisingly hard to say for some reason. But I want to give this conversation space because I believe it deserves space, and if it is a deal breaker for you, I think that that is absolutely your right to set that boundary here. And so I'm going to talk about this in relation to this being brought to Julia Quinn in an interview for Slate, because I was having trouble sourcing the original comment in question that I believe happened on a romance panel in relation to talking about how she envisioned diversity in her world and whether she envisioned herself writing diversely in her worlds. And so the question, which I believe is a little softball in the sense that it asks the question and clearly knows that it needs to be addressed, but also offers these little comments that undermine the severity a little bit. I don't know. So the question is, I do have to ask this because I've seen some talk of this online. A paraphrase quote from you is floating around the internet, sourced from people who attended book events in 2017 in which you were a panelist. Allegedly, you said that you don't write Black characters in your historical fiction because you don't want to write about characters who are suffering. Obviously, this is a boiled down quote that's been passed down telephone style from multiple different sources, so I'd love to hear your side on that. Which, on one hand, I think is fair in the sense that I was having trouble finding the full text or recording of the original comment, but also, like, let's just speak on it as it is. And I apologize because I am going to read this out just in case. I will try to put it up as well, but I feel like it deserves the full answer here. So this is Julia Quinn's response. So in 2017, I spoke awkwardly about race. It has definitely coalesced into something that's not entirely accurate, but I certainly was not articulate in my thoughts. I also think that I was under the apprehension at the time that in order to really honor Black history, well, I mean, there are obviously many other marginalized groups, but to your question, Black history, you had to be truthful about the various traumas and the history. Because the last thing I ever want to do is whitewash history in a way that removes Black people from spaces where they actually were. And so I really thought at the time that it would be disrespectful to try to go into history and pretend that these terrible things had not happened. So that's really where I was coming from, and I don't think I said it very clearly. And I think that since I muddled it, then other people muddled it, and it's something that's been very difficult for me, and to see it get muddled more and more, it's upsetting. But on the other hand, when you make mistakes and you don't say things clearly, you have to own it and you have to deal. I think it's great, honestly, the way that Shonda has opened up the Bridgerton world through casting people of different races and introducing race into the story. Overall, the thing I feel most is gratitude, because they were able to do something that I didn't know how to do. And also, even if I tried, I couldn't have done it as well. I don't have the same life experiences. That's the thing about television. It's such a collaborative process that we can talk all about, oh, this is so revolutionary. We've got Regé-Jean Page there, and we've got Simone Ashley there. But what you're not seeing is who's in the writer's room, who's in the director's chair. It's an incredibly diverse group of people. I mean, the scenes that you see in season 2 of the Haldi ceremony, that didn't come up in a vacuum. That's because there's really smart, wonderful women in the writer's room of Indian descent. And these are things I wouldn't have known how to do. So I love that there's now a group of people making this more diverse and inclusive. And what I'm realizing now, or I have realized, is just how important representation is. And I don't think that's something I understood earlier. I mean, in an academic way, yes. But now, after sort of living through it and hearing from people and hearing what it has meant for them to see somebody like them, I really do understand now, or hope I understand now, I should say, because let's be honest, I will never walk in the shoes of anybody who doesn't look like me, is how important it is for people not to just see themselves in the story, but to see themselves in the story with a happy ending. And that I really didn't understand before. Again, because I thought I had to honor history by not sanitizing the traumas that these people had gone through. So long, I know, I apologize, but I felt it was important to read all that. And honestly, I'm just impressed that I didn't stumble as much as I did, though it will clearly be tightened and cleaned up for you. So again, I'm not telling you how to feel about that because, again, I also am just a white woman who cannot anticipate the full breadth of what this means. However, also in terms of representation, if it wasn't going to be done well, I would rather it not be done at all, personally. But again, that is not an out either. So I think it's a really complicated discussion, and I'm glad to see growth in terms of mindset on that. And it is shameful to admit even how much growth there has been in that since 2017. The fact that romance is a very fast-moving genre, but we have seen a lot more representation in the last like 5 years or so, and the fact that it's taken this long to get more widespread in that representation is really shameful as well. And so I think that circles back to, because I've talked about in the show in particular, how the great experiment of it all, I feel like is kind of half-hearted. I feel like it existing at all, I don't know why, like why can't we just have these happy endings? But that's also not my place. But if we're going to do it, it feels a little bit half-baked at this point in my particular point of view, especially with the kind of reality of the politics at the time. And so it feels in some ways like we are not honoring what exactly was going on if we're going to do this kind of half-baked history. And I personally would have been able to go with the suspension of disbelief and the fantasy of it all if we wanted to move in that direction. However, there are pros and cons to that as well. And I remember as well, because I had been a fan of this series and was anticipating the adaptation, that there was some pushback, or I remember Julia Quinn posting on her Instagram in defense of Regé-Jean Page's casting when it was first announced. I mean, I had no issues clearly, but there is a subset, especially in historical romance, as much as I admittedly love it, of people who use historical accuracy as an excuse to whitewash. So it, again, is a much more nuanced conversation. And because of that, especially as I've said, because Queen Charlotte, the book, kind of takes us in a new direction. It puts kind of the idea of canon in question in some ways because it is tied to the Bridgerton novels with the Smythe Smiths, but it exists kind of outside of the Bridgertons as well. We get no references to the Bridgertons in this book, which we will talk about a little bit more when we dig into the book. I know this is a lot of kind of preemptive stuff, but I think it's important. So because of that, I think it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of put your money where your mouth is and invite a new voice into this world who could reflect that representation a little bit more honestly. But I also don't know the intellectual property side of it all, like the legalities of it all. And we could argue that Shonda Rhimes being on the book, credited as well, counts, but we could also have two Black women at the helm of this story. I also was trying to find, because obviously this, as much as anything, is Shonda Rhimes' creation, if there were other writers involved with these scripts, and I was having trouble finding credits. And the reason I was looking for this is because so much of the dialogue is pulled directly from the scripts, and Julia Quinn talks about having got the scripts ahead of time in this kind of translation to the page. And so I have this question, especially with the WGA strike of it all right now, when so much of this dialogue is being lifted verbatim, even while it fits Julia Quinn's voice in a lot of ways, which again is why I think that this series works so well on TV, because of that quippy dialogue, that fast-paced kind of nature of everything, the way the dialogue really pushes characters and development and connections, what have you. But it made me wonder, like, are there writers who wrote these lines that now aren't getting credit for them in the same way, aren't getting royalties from this book in the same way, and becomes a larger dialogue in terms of that as well? I am obviously on the side of writers always. So yeah, all of that aside, I was a little nervous jumping in, I'm not gonna lie, and not just because this was a book that was starting as a television show, which I definitely think impacted how it reads, how it was constructed, all of that, which we will go into, but also because the last book by Julia Quinn I read was in 2020, and it was First Comes Scandal, which is the fourth in the Rokesby series, which is considered the Bridgerton prequel series that had been coming out before the Bridgerton show dropped. Now this book, and there are some very delightful books in this series which came out much later than the Bridgertons, I did not like, which you could probably deduce from the setup of that statement. And I'm going to read you, I apologize to read to you again, the kind of last bit of my review for this book. And it says, but this book was also frustrating because it felt like the start of a novel, not a full novel. I felt like we got to spend as much time with the annoying cat, and don't get me wrong, I like cats, on the carriage ride as we did watching our protagonists develop their relationship. And then when they were on their own, away from the family, and there was the potential for new interesting conflicts and growth, we shrank away from it. I wanted to see more of their lives together. Instead, suddenly the novel was over and I was like, oh, that's the end. And I think that that kind of segues a little bit into this book. I liked this book better than that book, but I think that there were some limitations that the translation kind of put in place, as well as like not taking full ownership of the characters, which I think is part of those limitations. And so it felt like we were kind of spinning our wheels in similar ways, in that we had these, what were supposed to be these large emotional kind of revelations, and it didn't feel that way. It didn't feel as active. And I think part of the struggle here in terms of the structure of the thing for the book is that we are taking episodic structure for these different episodes that have their own kind of natural rises and falls, internal climaxes, as well as the overarching structure of the series itself. But then we have to kind of coalesce this and condense this into a novel, and that kind of structure works much differently on the page than on the screen, especially because we are doing a lot of storytelling visually in Queen Charlotte, especially when we see the kind of monotony of the day-to-day. We also have a bit of non-traditional structure in that we get Charlotte's point of view, and then we have the episode where we go back and get a little bit of George's point of view. And we get George's point of view in the book. We have 4 point of views in this book, in fact, but we are following time in a little bit more of a linear fashion. And so our point of views are Charlotte, George, Brimsley, and Agatha Lady Danbury. And for some reason, it feels disrespectful to refer to her as Agatha in the same way that there are still some teachers that I will never be able to call by their first name. So enjoy watching me struggle with that throughout this, I guess. So I was a little bit like, oh wow, that's a lot of points of view, though they were thankfully in third person. But even with those points of view, and I became really excited with the possibilities presented in the Brimsley and Agatha points of view and the ways that they could deepen what we saw on screen, show us a little bit more into that internal life, and kind of just deepen the scope of that story. However, all of the point of views were really still focused on the trajectory between Charlotte and George. And we did not have the contemporary timelines at all. And so when I talked about in the series how we had this kind of different point of view because we were in many ways looking back, while romance novels generally, with the idea of the happily ever after, are looking forward, here the novel itself was looking forward until the epilogue, which got us to the same place, but without all of the conflict with the modern timeline. And so we really were focused on these two at the start of their journeys and the choosing love of it all. But that means that some of the things that I would have liked to see explored even more in particularly Brimsley and Agatha's storylines were left out. In particular for Lady Danbury, we got nothing of the Lord Ledger plot lines, and we mostly were focused on her in relation to her relationship with Charlotte and how her understanding of the political climate and the Great Experiment pushed Charlotte forward. And so I understand that from a narrative point of view, but it was a little frustrating as a reader because it felt like there was this whole big piece of her story missing, and then it doesn't align with the show as much. In the same way with Brimsley, we got a little bit more of his relationship with Reynolds. We got a little bit more of his perspective on Reynolds, but honestly not as much as I was hoping. I think the most interesting addition here was there was a moment, spoiler alert I guess, where Charlotte and George do stumble upon Reynolds and Brimsley dancing in the moonlight. And that provided an extra layer then to the contemporary timeline in the show. So it's a question of, is this still the reality in the show? And so when Charlotte asks Brimsley that question, is there more knowledge there than we are given in the show? So all that being said, that's why I say the Smythe Smiths are our real connection to the Bridgerton books, because they are mentioned pretty heavily in the book in relation to Agatha's circle, which makes sense because that is Julia Quinn's wheelhouse. There is a whole series about them. But to my recollection, we get a reference to Lord Ledger dancing with Lady Danbury at their ball, but we don't really get any mentions of Violet, and it has been a second since I've read the Bridgerton Rokesby series, so I would need to go back to get kind of reference on the timeline and where we have Violet placed within those books, because we do get to start seeing the Bridgerton children popping up as cameos in those books, which honestly were the best part of the fourth book at least. So when we're looking at this structurally, it makes sense to focus on George and Charlotte, especially in terms of a romance novel, so that we have this more streamlined thing going on, but there is still opportunity and room for secondary romance. It's gone out of favor a little bit, admittedly, beyond setting up future books, which maybe we could be doing here. I would be very interested in that for sure. But, and I have become very aware of how much I say admittedly, so apologies for when I don't catch it, but it felt fitting here. It also kind of had more opportunity in this book, I think, to let that breathe a little bit more. The novel felt a little rushed in some places because it was really kind of beholden to the beats in the show. And so I feel like for me as a reader, all of the emotional resonance I was getting from the book was kind of holdover from what the show made me feel, because I don't know that the book really offered too much extra outside of our purview of the show itself. We got a couple tidbits, like with Brimsley, we learned that his parents had passed and he doesn't have siblings, which is particularly heartbreaking when we think about his trajectory as a character, at least for the show. So there are those little bits that have a kind of dramatic irony because we as readers, in theory, know the outcome of some of those things. And so because of that, there's a little bit more emotional relevance, a little bit more weight. However, when we talk about translating a book to a show, to a movie, to a play, there is this sense that you kind of have to take ownership of that material and take ownership particularly of the characters and make changes as necessary. Some of the most resonant pieces of television, of Bridgerton in particular, involve changes to the source material that still hit that emotional resonance, those beats, but they are shifted to fit the story being told. For instance, the bee scene in season 2, and I'm not saying it always gets it right, but you have to take those risks. And I don't think this novel really felt like it fully owned the characters. I don't feel like it took the risks in the prose in kind of shaping the thing. It didn't feel as raw or as vulnerable. It felt like we were just kind of going with the dialogue and the beats of the show, which I do understand on one hand, because the show is so new. This is a direct tie-in to the show. And so if a reader is going in from the show, they're going to be expecting that story that just gave them such a high. I mean, I'm assuming here, but I assume that if you are seeking out the book after the show, that you had some emotional connection to something. So I can understand things being changed being hard for a reader to kind of accept, though we did have that big change with Lord Ledger getting left out, but that was a little bit more, I think, to streamline the action, because again, we were focusing really on George and Charlotte here. And we did have moments I appreciated, particularly in George's point of view. I don't think we delved fully into his mental illness in the sense that we didn't sit and dwell there, but we also paid respect to it and the choices he was making in regards to it. And we got the kind of thought spiral from when Charlotte sees that side of him for the first time. And so I actually think that that is really delicate work that was handled pretty well. And again, because Quinn's writing and voice move so quickly, there are a lot of kind of like really short staccato phrases, especially in the thought process, that kind of mirror the dialogue. And I think it was pretty natural. And it also presented George then, especially because we were seeing his point of view more in real time. And I would argue the show is more of Queen Charlotte's point of view, which makes sense because it is her story. The book, the show is named after her. But here we're seeing George a little bit more as a traditional romance hero in some ways, because we're getting to see more of this gradient and this idea that he feels himself unworthy of his romantic interest in this book. And so we get to see a lot more of that active fight that, oh, I can't be near her because it will ruin something in her life. I'm not going to boil it down to the tortured hero, because it is a much more nuanced discussion than that with its representation of mental health. And I thought that the mental health angle of everything, especially in the book, was going to be extra hard to maneuver, because while it felt respectful in the show, even as it was kind of this weird amalgamation, because George historically, obviously his mental health was aggravated and exacerbated later in life. And so when you accelerate it, it's harder to kind of connect to a real mental illness and kind of root it in reality without it becoming parody. And I do think they walked a very fine line. I personally felt they maneuvered it pretty well and were really respectful, especially to this idea of people deserving love exactly where they are. And that choosing love is not always going to be easy. It involves a kind of lifelong fight in some ways, but you are in something together, and what that can mean and what that can do, but that it's not going to solve everything, and that not everything has to be solved. Charlotte, we see the struggle Charlotte has. She recognizes the kind of challenge of it all, but she also recognizes George as just George, exactly where he is. And that just George of it all really resonates, and also kind of brings him back, because we usually stay away from real people, especially in historical romance, as a genre, rather than like maybe historical fiction with romantic leanings. And we usually stay away from royalty, even if we're playing with things. That is why you see so many dukes. And there is an argument that can be made against the dukes, and this idea that there are just a plethora of young, attractive dukes out there. Though usually each romance series that I read maybe has one or two dukes. If there's more than one duke, they acknowledge that it is so unusual to have so many marriageable dukes. dukes out. But I have also read, I believe, or no, I listened to Sarah McLean talk about this, how publishers are really pushing that because that is what readers are gravitating toward, because I would assume that's as high as you can get in the kind of power structure without touching royalty. So it's kind of like the billionaire romances of the historical romance genre. But here we have a prince, who is really removed from that side of things, and it really focuses on the just George of it all. And I also think that there's something really powerful about showing, you know, humans are humans no matter what part of the social hierarchy they may fall into, but it also then leads to the potential kind of criticism or critique that it's not engaging with the realities of that and is kind of romanticizing that side of things. And here, of course, that is further complicated by George's mental illness and the realities of that. And we still see the doctor here, though it also plays back into that idea of George as king versus just George. It's obviously still visceral in a different way, and it feels like it was really leaning into the language of having George really repeat and break him down with language that he is nobody, that is the way that we saw the violence of what the doctor was doing to George. We obviously had the references to the chair and the ice baths, but because you don't have the same sense of that necessarily when reading as on screen, that dialogue really helped to kind of hit home a lot of that. And it really did reinforce something that I noticed in the show as well, that I think the book kind of touched on, but like the show really didn't dive into, was this idea of Charlotte being calming to George in some ways because she was such a commanding presence and that she could take charge in some ways. And I think we could have easily seen that translated to taking charge in other ways that weren't explored, and I think that some of that was probably to remain respectful to the exploration of mental health within the show, but I don't know that diving into that would have to be totally disrespectful, though potentially a little much for audiences. But in relation to the more intimate scenes in the book, I honestly felt like the show pushed that a little bit more, because we got a couple of scenes, especially the first wedding night, the real wedding night when that happened, but some of the other scenes that we get in the show, most notably the dining room scene, were kind of hopping points of view. For instance, there we're kind of in Brimsley's head as he's standing outside the door, which is still entertaining, but we definitely pull back from the more intimate, spicier bits, whatever you want to call it, a little bit. And I think some of that may just be a disconnect in where those moments are pushing the story forward in the book versus in the show. In the show, we have lots of different episodes, as previously discussed, so that kind of intimacy can be used in a much different way. And we see it. We see the even days of it all in the book, but it's a lot more of those kind of after discussions in bed that I do not believe we see as many on this show. Some of those may be additions, not all of them. So there is a different kind of intimacy at every level, and we are still attempting, like I said, to follow a kind of more traditional romance structure. Now, this is not, you know, cut and dry, going to be like this in every book, but we have that kind of big declaration moment, that kind of coming to a head at around 80%. And so we are still before that declaration, or sometimes in romances, kind of external influence, sometimes miscommunication, but it's where our couple really has to make a choice. And so we see that kind of fall when Charlotte goes to Q and kind of pulls a declaration from George, makes him confront his feelings and offers her feelings in return. And so we are following the structure of the show, but like I said, we obviously kind of have to fit it within the book structure a little bit as well, and it doesn't always do it perfectly, because for me personally, it didn't feel like we were getting to know these characters as intimately. It felt potentially like we knew them more intimately than we did because we could carry over from the show. We had those acting choices fresh in our minds in whatever way, which is the way those characters are revealed to us a lot of times in the show, but the prose never really felt like it claimed those characters in its own way, which is part of going back to that making those characters your own or taking control of them in some way, which is always a little scary and a little bit of a risk, especially when it is a character that people have connected with on some level. Now, in the creative process, they didn't, in theory, have an idea of how exactly the show is going to be received, but there is still that idea that this character already exists and then claiming it. And they did the most with Charlotte in terms of kind of showing her quick-wittedness, and they played with the idea of the German language and the fact that Charlotte didn't speak English when she came over, and that she was constantly searching for German equivalents in English, this idea of like smushing words together to make this larger idea of a thing, which fits within Quinn's writing and that kind of quippiness and her sharper characters and sharper heroines in particular, I would argue. And I think in that way, Queen Charlotte really does fit within the larger world of Bridgerton and Quinn's writing because she is so smart and witty and quick thinking. And I love being able to see George's reaction to that in real time as well. And I do like being in his head to get a sense of what he feels for her and how intrinsically he is drawn to her from the beginning. It was just interesting with his character in particular because so much of the narrative strives to push back against this idea of him as a king versus him as just a person, just George, Farmer George, whatever we want to call it. And it's this really delicate balance of understanding the enormity of the title he holds and what that means and the pressure that's been put upon him and the politics of it all, but also kind of getting to know him as a person. And we really are pushing this idea of his love of the sciences and of knowledge and farming to whatever extent. It doesn't really go into the farming quite as much here, but it still doesn't feel like we know him necessarily as a person outside of his role, but on some level he's still very guarded, which is understandable. And in the show we can show a lot more vulnerability, especially through small acting choices, those little subtle moments, the hand grazes of it all, though I'm not necessarily speaking of hand grazes here, but the book doesn't feel like it knows him quite as deeply as a character. It doesn't feel like it allows us to get to know him as deeply. We see him really drawn to Charlotte. We see him striving to protect her in whatever way he can, but at the same time, we don't really know him. And I recognize that this is also tricky because these are real people, and at a certain point you have to like claim these real people as your own, and you're going to always have, I think, historical purists that are angry at any misinterpretation of the history, but also then these are characters in and outside of their actual history, because we're already changing the history itself, and that changing of the history also informs the narrative. But what I'm saying is we are already taking artistic liberties with this and kind of twisting the history to be like, what if? So I think that that offers a little bit more liberty with this characterization as well. Now, the book doesn't have the kind of disclaimer at the beginning that this is just fiction, this is not history. But I think as a reader, we are a little bit more allowing of that, or at least I didn't see it. And I was reading a digital library book, so there's always the possibility that that front matter in the book got kind of moved around. I've seen it happen before. So it's either the assumption that you've seen it or the assumption that when you're reading historical romance, historical fiction, there is more that assumption of the fiction of it all, which means that I think that there was the opportunity to take a little bit more control of these characters and kind of shape them within their own story a little bit more as well, give them a little bit more depth. We did have these historical details that were already there in whatever level of truth. For instance, Charlotte's love of the arts and her patronage of Mozart, but it didn't feel like we really, especially Charlotte, who already is kind of a guarded character, and that is one of the really interesting things about her journey, I think, is that we see George kind of open her up in a way as well. And it makes sense that she's guarded because she is in this completely foreign place with foreign people that are judging her from the outset, and George represents a safe place for her. And this idea of going over the wall, whatever that may mean. But we don't seem to really get into the fullness of her. I think that Quinn tried to address this a little bit in the book, especially by giving her more kind of small moments with Brimsley in particular, or kind of expanding her friendship with Lady Danbury a little bit more, but there is still that angle to it. I guess. And speaking of broadening friendships a little bit more, I really liked that we got more of a history between George and Reynolds. We got this backstory that they had grown up together and they used to be friends. And so there is still this kind of closeness and this idea that Reynolds is one of the only people that George trusts, and also seeing as Charlotte becomes like his person, how Brimsley becomes one of the only people he trusts. Now, the book does not solve our question, or answer our question, I should say, in relation to Brimsley and Reynolds' relationship and their future together. And it almost in some ways makes it more heartbreaking in relation to the dancing in the moonlight scene, because we see them kind of fantasizing when the king and queen are getting along, that if the king and queen are together, their households are together, and then there's this possibility of a future for the two of them in a way that they have never allowed themselves to envision before, because it hasn't seemed like a possibility. And so that is still a kind of unresolved thread as well, or adds another angle to it in a way that I am curious as to whether we're going to see more from this, or if it was just meant to function as another knife between the ribs. And so when I talk about the narrative not feeling like it has truly kind of claimed itself in this new form, what I mean is we have this kind of repetition. We have these like small little moments, like those moments with Brimsley, like the moments especially with King George, where we're getting kind of more insight into both his treatment, his state of mind, his history with Reynolds. We get these little peaks of additional information that feel like we're broadening the world, but at the same time, we are really beholden still to these plot beats in a way that it feels like we have to hit them. And so it feels like the book hasn't maneuvered them into their own thing to forward its own arc and its own action. And so the emotional resonance, like I said before, then ties back to what we think of the show, or what the show made us feel, rather than what the book is making us feel. And the action of it doesn't feel like it has the same sense of urgency. We don't know what we're building toward. Our characters aren't really taking action a lot of the time, or when they do take action, it's unclear what really spurred them to that action. We don't really have that through line in the same way, and it reads really well on screen, but in the book they don't make as much sense, and some of it, maybe the time jumps of it, in the show they're not as evident, or we are seeing it a lot more visually, and we are not creating that same atmosphere with the prose of the book as we are creating with the shots in the show. And so we have to kind of make up for those limitations in some way, and the book just didn't fully get over that hurdle for me. It was a quick read, but I don't know if I would classify it as an engaging read, because I don't know what more it really offered me as a reader outside of the show. And I think that a lot of that comes back to the fact that the story was initially envisioned and shaped to be a show. I think that the Bridgerton show really stands apart from the series in a lot of ways. It complements the book series in a lot of ways, and it updates the series in a lot of ways, because we then go back to that conversation of romance moving quickly and this being a series that's 20 years old. And so while I don't know that I would say it's better than the books, probably partly just because of the emotional connection and the nostalgia of the books as well, because you know that I will definitely call out problematic material or moments in the original series, but that they kind of each stand on their own. And so I wouldn't necessarily call one better, but that they are two very interesting, compelling pieces of a similar universe. But here we have a book that is really trying to mirror the experience of the show in a narrative form. And I don't think that it ultimately distilled it in its own medium, because I think that it comes down to you shape a story around the form you are telling that story in. And ideally, when you're setting out to tell a story, you are telling it in the way that story needs to be told. It goes back to this question dramaturgically of, why is this play a play? Why here? Why now? I think in things like television and movies, the why here, why now of it is a little less kind of at the forefront of things, but we are still engaging with that in the kind of modernization. And so I think we also then have to ask how we envision this as a book when we are kind of reverse engineering it. And so inherently, in theory, a story is going to be best in the form it was originally envisioned in. However, if you make that thing your own, it can also transcend. For instance, The Notebook. Hated the book, Movie was entertaining. Musical, I would argue, was the best form of that story for me as an audience member. And that's not completely out of place because it relates back to Queen Charlotte in that the Notebook musical has 3 kind of iterations of these characters at different points of their life on stage engaging with each other as memory in some way at all times. In Queen Charlotte the show, we are looking back on kind of the hope of it all in some ways. We are reminiscing on the promise while looking to the future. And in the book, we are looking to the future. Like, that's where we're sitting. And I think that there are really engaging ways to do that. But I don't know, like I said, that the novel truly knew where the heart of its story lay. And I also want to be clear that it is a hard, tricky endeavor. And like I said before, I think it was still trying to shape a more traditional romance narrative while hitting the overarching kind of relationship beats that exist in the show as part of that narrative. And I think that it still could have done that, but taken a little bit more ownership of the in-between, and you still have those moments from the show, but it becomes its own thing a little bit more as well, because if you are reading the book as well as the show, you want to live in this world a little bit more. So again, I recognize that there will probably be a little bit more pushback in the book if you take more liberties, but at the same time, it's a different experience, it's a different medium, so offer the person going on this journey something slightly different. And we got that a little bit with the points of view, which I think were really interesting, but didn't go as far as I think they could have, and part of that may have been just length constraints as well, but I do on one hand like that they were still serving Charlotte and George's story inherently. Like, we got a little bit more of Brimsley and Agatha, but in service of Charlotte and George's story. And while initially I wanted to see more of their story revealed, I don't think it would have done it justice. But at the same time, it's like, why were those points of view there if we weren't going to fully explore them in some way, I guess? So what I'm saying is I understand that there is a risk to playing with that and taking ownership of it in a couple of different ways. One being potential response from audiences that are coming from the show and expect to see that reflected in the narrative, that experience reflected. But also I would argue that part of the reason that that experience isn't being fully reflected is because that ownership hasn't been taken and the emotional resonance is reliant then on the show rather than its own kind of internal inherent logic and characterization. But also there's just the risk of the story then in and of itself in kind of moving it off of the set path. So it's not easy, and I can't tell you how to do it, but I think that there was just opportunity there to help this stand on its own feet as a work as well. Because right now it's a fine novelization, and I think it actually did a pretty good job with the epilogue, because that final scene, the whole book, I was wondering, like, how are we going to hit this emotional beat that works so well in the show without the kind of visual mechanics of the show and not having really engaged with that contemporary plot line beyond a Lady Whistledown letter from the beginning of the book. But I just don't know what extra it gave me. Why am I engaging with this material, with this story again in a new format? What new perspective of this story do we have to offer? Now, you know, when I was 10 years old and we were distilling whatever movie into a chapter book, that's one thing. That is getting kids to read with material they want to engage with from other parts of their life. But this is an opportunity to tell a story from a different angle, to add depth in different places, or just to utilize the strengths and opportunities in different forms of storytelling. And here, I just don't know that we fully utilized those strengths and opportunities. What I will say is, again, I read the ebook from the library, but I have seen that the hardcover, should this be a hardcover? No, this should be a mass market, but we have seen how the industry is trending. The hardcover of this novel, I would personally not pay hardcover prices for this as well, but to the point, has a reversible cover. And so a lot of people are like, oh, this is the future of tie-in covers. I like the instinct. However, tie-in covers generally are paperback, because generally we've seen a property move from book to television or movie, and then we get the tie-in cover. And so we are seeing a lot more projects kind of optioned before they've been fully released. So there is still the possibility of this. And I do like it, especially for a work you really, really enjoy, if they do release a hardcover, but I just don't know if the hardcover first model is sustainable. So I would love for this to be the answer, but logistically, I don't know if it's the answer, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I would love to hear your thoughts on Queen Charlotte as a book if you have read it, or what you see the opportunities and challenges of translating this story from the screen to the page, whether you've read the book yet or not. I would just love to hear your thoughts all around. And again, while this is definitely not my least favorite Julia Quinn that I have read, it is also not my favorite, and I don't know if I would put it in the top half either. And I can make the distinction because I think the Shonda Rhimes credit of it all on the book comes from that dialogue, and it's very evident if you've seen the show what dialogue is show dialogue. So yeah, I just would be very interested to hear what you're thinking here, and wanted to make sure we talked about the book even just a little bit since this is a bookish channel. But as always, I really appreciate you hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. We are like inching to 1,000, so I would really appreciate the interaction right now, but know that I hate asking for it. But what I don't mind asking, or telling you to do, I guess, is to read something good. So yeah, bye.